In the mid-1950s, life in rural California moved at a weathered pace. Families relied on their own, and the law rarely felt like a comforting presence in the cramped parlor or at the kitchen table. Back then, the notion that a teenage girl could be treated as a commodity simply because she carried a child was horrifying, and yet it happened. The laws meant to protect young people were still under construction, and enforcement was uneven at best. Agencies like Child Protective Services existed on paper, but resources were scant, and rumors of abuse often died behind closed doors before anyone ever knocked on that family's doorstep. At the same time, the wider United States was only beginning to recognize the concept of surrogate motherhood. Contracts drawn up in sterile legal offices sometimes skirted ethical lines entirely because no one had yet asked, what happens if the woman carrying the child is under 18? It was another decade before the infamous Baby M case would force courts to wrestle publicly with the rights of a birth mother versus the wishes of commissioning parents. That 1988 decision in New Jersey underscored precisely how murky those waters could become, even when all parties were ostensibly consenting adults. For a young teenager with no formal education, no clear advocate, and no voice in the courtroom, the gap between legal theory and personal safety could swallow her whole. In small towns like Bakersfield or elsewhere in the Central Valley, a woman's reputation was as fragile as the plain white dresses she wore to Sunday service. The unspoken expectation was that every girl should protect her family's honor, yet somehow the family could betray her most severely. When a mother or grandfather stood between a girl and her rights, the community often closed its eyes. Teachers noticed that she seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn, but reporting suspicions was seen as meddling. A school principal might murmur, "Let's give her time," leaving the real danger to fester in silence. Local clinics, too, had their hands tied by privacy rules and a misplaced belief that what happened under one roof stayed under one roof. Socially, a young woman's worth was still too often measured by her purity and her obedience. Even in the bustling cities of California, the only conversations about reproductive rights revolved around married women, never unmarried teenagers, who were already mothers themselves. Rural health departments lacked resources to follow up on late prenatal appointments. We assumed she was busy, a county nurse might recall years later, or that it was a late marriage. Getting medical professionals to question her living situation felt like rearranging hay bales in a barn, awkward and easily avoided. Meanwhile, popular culture was teaching a different story. Television shows and glossy magazines showcased smiling nuclear families, but they never told you what a runaway girl might face if she returned home pregnant. Church groups held bake sales and charity drives, but they often prioritized fundraising over asking the hard questions. How old is the young mother, or does she have a safe place to sleep tonight? In too many congregation, parishioners nodded sympathetically at a lonely young woman in the pew, then quickly turned away when she crossed herself during the service. At the national level, the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act was still decades away. Federal initiatives to combat human trafficking or forced labor would not gain real traction until the 1990s. What little funding did reach county sheriffs for child welfare investigations was earmarked mostly for runaways or street youth in big cities like Los Angeles or San Francisco, not for girls trapped in quiet inland towns. A sheriff's deputy would rather chase stolen livestock than answer a whisper that a girl's grandfather might be exploiting her fertility. The local paper might carry a brief mention, "Girl missing from home," or "Teen returns late from visit," and the story ended there. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the women's rights movement gained momentum in America's coastal centers. Yet those urban protests, sit-ins, marches, and consciousness-raising groups felt surprisingly distant if you lived where the nearest freeway ran past almond orchards. The rhetoric of reproductive choice and bodily autonomy was powerful in New York City or Washington, D.C. But on the back roads of Kern County, it sounded like an abstract demand that rarely translated into tangible protection for a frightened teenager. If it weren't for the occasional traveling social worker or a sympathetic teacher brave enough to bend rules, many girls would slip through the cracks entirely. Even federal courts, when pressed, struggled to fill the void. Decisions on adult surrogacy contracts didn't extend protections to minors, and while family courts could, and sometimes did, remove children from abusive homes, proving exploitation required testimony that a young girl simply couldn't give. In that twilight between childhood and adulthood, her silence spoke volumes, but no one listened. It would take years before case law recognized that a minor's capacity for consent is fundamentally different from an adult's, and still more years before statutes explicitly outlawed any contract for surrogacy signed by someone under 18. It is within this patchwork landscape of legal grey zones and cultural blind spots that Grandma Teresa's story begins. Born into hardship in 1956, she grew up believing that her value was to be invisible until the day her own grandfather saw her as a means to settle debts, rather than as a vulnerable child in need of care. Understanding the world she inhabited with its selective compassion and outdated statutes sheds light on how her exploitation could unfold so systematically, and how so many bystanders could justify looking the other way. Yet this history is more than just background. It explains how a society's failure to protect its most fragile members can become the foundation for gross human rights abuses. As we move on to explore Teresa's personal journey, the dissociation she used to survive, the courage it took to record secret notes about each forced pregnancy, and the moment she decided to fight back, we will see how deeply the roots of her torment were embedded in those decades-old laws and attitudes. Her struggle was never just personal. It was a confrontation with an entire system that allowed her to be treated as merchandise rather than a child in need of protection. And so, with that context in mind, let us step into Teresa's world, into the frightened 7-year-old who first felt her grandfather's eyes linger too long, and into the lonely early teen who realized that her body could be bought and sold even before the dawn of her 13th birthday. In the next section, we will turn from the broad social forces at play to the intimate details of how one girl's mind and spirit adapted, endured, and ultimately found the strength to resist. When I look back on those years between my first forced pregnancy at 13 and the moment I finally found a way out, it's as though my mind lived in two places at once. On the one hand, I was a terrified child, huddled on a cold mattress, waiting for the next knock at the door. On the other, I was floating above it all, watching my own life happen like a distant film. Psychologists today call that dissociation. For me, it was pure survival. Every time the doorbell rang, a tiny part of me would snap back into my body heart, pounding so violently I thought it might burst. Then, once the intruder's footsteps faded, I would drift away again, my thoughts untethered from the horror of what had just happened. I would replay the scene over and over, not to memorize it, but to bury it under layers of numbness. Later, when the nightmares came, they were vivid and brutal rooms, filled with strange men in suits, their eyes glinting with expectation, the sting of cold metal on my skin, the helplessness of a child's body unable to resist. In those days, nobody taught me what to call these experiences. I simply thought I was losing my mind. Looking back now, I see how remarkably resilient the human spirit can be, how the brain will create these gaps in memory as an emergency brake against overwhelming pain. It's much like the veterans returning from Vietnam, unable to reconcile the horrors they witnessed with the life they left behind. or like Sybil, whose dissociative identity disorder kept her trapped in a maze of personalities to escape childhood trauma. These examples show that dissociation isn't a weakness. It's the mind's last-ditch effort to protect itself when there's nowhere else to turn. Still living in that half-dream, half-waking state came at a price. I began to notice cracks in my sense of self. I would wake up in the morning without any idea where my own body had been the night before. I questioned whether the subtle joy I felt when sunlight slipped through the window was real or just another trick of my battered mind. And worst of all, I developed what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Flashbacks struck without warning. The click of a lock, the scrape of a chair, the scent of antiseptic from a doctor's office could hurl me back into that house in Bakersfield in an instant. One afternoon, long after I had escaped, I was working in a bakery in East LA when a customer sneezed twice in quick succession. The sudden noise was innocent enough, but my hands flew to cover my ears as if bracing for a gunshot. The man behind the counter gave me a worried look. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked softly. I nodded, blinking away tears. But inside I was still in that dim room, waiting for a hand to land on my shoulder. It took me a full minute to remind myself that I was safe, that I was 30 miles from home, 20 years older and free. As a teenager, I had no guidebook for these feelings, just an aching sense that something was very wrong with me. I tried to write down fragments of my story on scraps of paper, tucking them under the floorboards or inside the hem of my dress. I recorded dates October 12th, 69, one man, no pain, or March 2nd, 71, tearing pain, bleeding. I sketched rough faces, hands curled in fists the shape of a newborn's head. I had no idea how I might use these notes one day, but I felt driven to preserve them as though they were holy relics that proved I had lived through something no one should ever endure. My secret note-keeping was a strategy shared by other women caught up in human trafficking, particularly along the southern border. Aid workers have found diaries and scrapbooks hidden in border towns, detailing the dates, descriptions, and even license plate numbers of men who forced them into cars or motel rooms. These scraps of evidence later helped investigators track down traffickers and reunite survivors with their families. Like those women, I felt powerless in the moment, but I refused to let my story vanish into thin air. When I finally escaped, it was those very notes that became the raw material for my testimony to the Sacramento newspaper. I laid each photograph and scribbled page before reporters, and they turned them into a narrative that shook the town to its core. Without dissociation, I doubt I could have survived long enough to compile that proof. But neither could I have healed without learning to bridge the gap between my fractured selves. Therapy arrived in my life 6 months after I reached Los Angeles. Jeanette, my herbal healer, insisted I see a psychologist. The first sessions were excruciating. My therapist sat across from me, pen poised, expecting me to recount every detail, every agonizing moment in a neat chronological order. I broke down. I felt torn apart all over again. I learned later that therapists call this re-traumatization, forcing the mind to relive wounds before building the coping skills to process them. It's a common mistake in trauma therapy. Gradually, my therapist adjusted her approach. She introduced me to cognitive behavioral therapy, helping me spot the destructive thoughts that accompanied my flashbacks. I'm broken. I'm worthless. I deserved it. We worked together to challenge those beliefs and replace them with truths. I survived. I am worthy of love. I have the right to my own body. She taught me grounding exercises, pressing my feet against the floor, naming 3 things I could see in the room, reciting my full name and birth date whenever I felt myself drifting into a flashback. In time, she recommended EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing a therapy, in which I followed her fingers with my eyes while bringing a traumatic memory to mind. It was like guiding a wounded animal gently back to safety, showing those old neural pathways they no longer had to carry so much pain. After a handful of sessions, the memories lost some of their power. The thunder of my heart would still echo if I thought too long about that blue dress or the soft click of a lock, but it was no longer all-consuming. Alongside professional treatment, I found immense comfort in peer support. I joined a small group of survivors at a community center in East LA. At first, I sat in silence, convinced that sharing my ordeal would break me down. But as others spoke women who had escaped cults, trafficking rings, domestic violence, I realized that our stories, though painful, created a bridge between us. We could say things to one another that the rest of the world wouldn't understand. The fatigue of hypervigilance, the guilt of survival, the shame of feeling pleasure in something as simple as a warm cup of coffee. Each meeting we practiced breathing together. We shared strategies for dealing with nightmares. We reminded each other that we were not alone. I also returned to my childhood hobby drawing and found it a profound form of therapy. I sketched again the old house in Bakersfield, the lace collar of the dress, the face of the first child they took from me. But this time I added soft edges, light, coming through windows, hopeful colors at the margins. I filled blank journals with short poems. Sometimes I wrote letters to my younger self, promising protection and love. Those journals became a map of my healing. Looking back, I see the mistakes that nearly cost me my chance at recovery. Diving too quickly into trauma narratives, isolating myself in fear, waiting for a single perfect moment to feel safe. Instead, real healing came in small steps, a morning without tears, a conversation with Sebastian that didn't end in panic, a shared laugh with a friend who had once sat where I sat. It came in the stillness of a hot cup of tea, the solidity of my feet on the bakery floor, the rough texture of a pencil between my fingers. My mind may never be completely free of those darker chapters, but it no longer needs to fragment in order to survive. I learned that strength isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to show up for yourself day after day and choose life over the shadows. In the next section, we will explore how I gathered the courage and the evidence to confront the people who had stolen my adolescence, how I planned my escape in secret, and how a single act of bravery set the stage for justice. I spent months after my surgery quietly preparing for the moment I would finally break free. Every morning I woke to the same rigid routine, my grandfather's footsteps creaking on the stairs, his gruff voice demanding breakfast, my trembling hands pouring tea tainted with uterine tonics. Yet beneath that stillness, my mind was racing, cataloguing every detail I would need to escape and ensure justice. The first step was money. My grandfather was careless with his newfound wealth, letting fat bills sit in a beaten leather wallet tucked beneath his bedside table. I watched him every night, noting when he counted the day's payments from clients, as he called them. One evening, after he'd fallen into a whiskey-soaked stupor, I slipped into his room, lifted the edge of the nightstand, and retrieved 20 crisp $100 bills wrapped in a rubber band. I tucked them beneath my own mattress, my heart thundering, but the fear of being caught paled beside the promise of freedom. Next came the documents. My grandfather prided himself on keeping meticulous records, ledgers of payments, appointment schedules, even copies of my birth certificate and old-school report cards. He kept them locked in a small wooden desk, one drawer secured by a simple brass key. I watched him habitually hang that key on a nail inside his closet. For nights on end, I fashioned a duplicate key from hardened soap, cutting it with the tip of my nail file until it fit the lock just enough. The first time I turned it, my hands shook so violently I thought I'd leave a fingerprint in the soap. But the drawer opened, and there lay my whole life, yellowed pages stuffed with names of strangers who had used my body dollar amounts, scrawled in neat columns and dates marking each forced pregnancy. I photographed every page with a small Kodak camera I'd borrowed from the neighbour's son. He thought I was experimenting with photography, capturing the yard's flowers. No one suspected the truth of my clandestine project. The flash briefly illuminated my grandfather's disapproving portrait on the wall, but I held my breath and kept clicking until I had images of every ledger entry, every page of the appointment books, every invoice for tea and midwife visits. I knew these photos would become my shield. If I could present them to the authorities or the press, I could expose the monster who called himself my protector. But evidence alone would not be enough. I needed a witness, someone beyond my grandmother's house, beyond Bakersfield's dusty roads. That's when I thought of Jeanette, the elderly healer who had tended my wounds after each birth, with gentle words and herbal poultices. She knew my story better than anyone. I remembered how in her creaking kitchen she had pressed chamomile into my palms and whispered, "You deserve so much more than this life." Her compassion had given me the courage to keep breathing. If I could trust anyone, it was her. So one afternoon I sent a note with a neighbour girl asking Jeanette to meet me behind the church at dusk. She arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon, her shawl wrapped tight and her eyes lined with worry. I revealed my plan to her, the money, the documents, the photographs. I would flee under the cover of night. She would guide me to a safe house in Los Angeles. From there, she would connect with a journalist she had once helped when he covered a small-scale labor scandal. The newspaper was the Sacramento Bee, respected with enough regional reach to make our story impossible to ignore. Jeanette's trembling hands held mine as she listened. "We must move carefully," she cautioned. "Even one misstep and your grandfather's friends in the sheriff's office will swoop down on you." She taught me how to remove my scent from the sheets, how to disguise my footprints by walking backward in damp soil, and how to fold my hair under a simple kerchief so I would not be recognized as the fair-haired girl everyone in Bakersfield knew. In those final days of planning, each minute felt both gloriously alive and unbearably tense. I continued playing my role, silent, obedient, meek, while my mind replayed every detail of the escape, the moment I would slip from my window. The silent path through my grandfather's orchard, the rough twist of metal on the screen, the cold breath of freedom on my face. I moved my stash of bills and documents into a small canvas bag, securing it under a loose floorboard until the appointed hour. We chose the night of May 15th, 1979. My grandfather was set to attend a lodge meeting in the next county, a gathering he had been looking forward to for weeks. He bragged to my mother that he'd network with important men who could expand his circle of clients. I listened with clenched fists, tasting victory on the tip of my tongue. That night, as his car engine rumbled to life, I slipped out of the house in my nightdress. Jeanette, waiting at the back gate in a faded green scarf. The orchard's rows of almond trees felt like a cathedral, an echoing hall of shadows. Every rustle of leaves made me pause, but Jeanette's steady whisper, "Keep going," child pushed me forward. We reached the dusty road where her nephew's battered Chevy was parked under a street lamp's weak glow. He was 70 miles from the city, but eager to help. I climbed into the passenger seat, my bag clutched to my chest, and pressed my head against the window as the tires crunched gravel, carrying me toward Los Angeles and away from the nightmare I would never return to. In the weeks that followed, I handed the photographs and ledgers to the Bee's investigative reporter, a fast-talking man who smelled of coffee and ambition. He promised me anonymity, but he knew he wouldn't need to hide my story. When the article ran on June the 2nd, Its headline blazed across the front page: Bakersfield surrogacy scandal girl exploited for 10 forced pregnancies. The evidence was there for all to see: copies of the appointment books, photos of money transfers, and a plea from a young woman known only as Teresa. The sheriff's office could no longer ignore it. Within days, my grandfather was arrested, along with 2 complicit doctors and a former deputy, who had turned a blind eye men of power who had believed themselves untouchable. Yet my journey wasn't over. The story's publication brought a storm of attention phone calls, at all hours late-night knocks at the door of the safe house, threats against Jeanette me, and even the neighbor's boy who had lent me the camera. I learned that justice often comes at a cost. We moved again farther into Los Angeles, switching safe houses until the trial concluded. I testified behind a screen, my voice shaky but resolute, as I described the ledger entries as if they were a poem of survival. In the courtroom's hush, as the jury filed in, I felt a quiet triumph. I was no longer the powerless girl hidden by shame. I was the woman who had collected evidence, built a case, and forced my oppressors to face the consequences of their cruelty. When the verdict came guilty on multiple counts of human trafficking, statutory rape, and conspiracy, it was like watching the sun break through a storm-dark sky. After the trial, I received letters from women across California. Some still trapped. Some just finding their voices, thanking me for speaking out. Aid organizations offered legal aid and counseling. The Bee ran follow-up stories on reforms in state law regarding underage surrogacy contracts. It was the first time I understood that my escape and testimony could ripple outward, changing lives beyond my own. But I also learned that the path to justice is seldom straight. My mother refused to speak to me after testifying against her father. Friends I had clung to suddenly found better things to do. I discovered that exposing corruption often means severing ties with everyone who knew you before. Yet in that sacrifice lay a lesson: sometimes the only way to build a new life is to let the old one burn away entirely. Today, the name Gerald Matthews is catalogued alongside other traffickers in state archives. A cautionary tale of how family bonds can be perverted into instruments of abuse. Jeanette's safe houses have inspired a network of hideaways for survivors, modelled after our clandestine roots. And I, Teresa, once a ledger entry in my grandfather's book, am now a living testament to the power of bearing witness, gathering facts, and refusing to be silenced. In the next chapter, we will step into the early days of my life in Los Angeles, where I found work, shelter, and unexpectedly the first sparks of hope that would eventually lead me to love, to community, and to a family of my own choosing. I arrived in Los Angeles with trembling knees and a heart half buried in fear. The city's roar felt like 1,000 voices crowding around me, each one a reminder that I had escaped, but was still so far from feeling safe. Jeanette insisted I find honest work right away, something with a schedule and a paycheck I could count on. She took me to a small bakery on a side street in East LA, where the owner, Mrs. Alvarez, hired me on the spot as a dough mixer and morning baker's assistant. My first morning on the job, I showed up before dawn. The bakery smelled of yeast and sugar and possibility. Mrs. Alvarez pointed to a stainless steel table and handed me a rolling pin. "Just keep your mind on the work," she said kindly. "The oven doesn't care about your past." I rolled the dough until it smoothed under my palms, and for a few minutes I was just a young woman making bread. No ledger entries, no forced appointments, just the rhythmic push and pull of dough and a simple goal: feed people. Working in that bakery became my anchor. The routine was gentle medicine. I learned how to mix flour and water into fluffy loaves, how to know by feel when a dough had rested enough, how the warmth of the oven whispered promises of fresh starts. My hands, once instruments of pain, found new purpose shaping roles for school children, slathering jam on scones for busy commuters. Each tray I slid into the oven felt like another step away from the dark house in Bakersfield. Yet the shadows followed me. One afternoon, as I dusted sugar over cinnamon buns, I caught sight of my reflection in the polished steel. My shoulders stiffened. My breath caught. The image was just me, flour-dusted apron, and all but my mind flinched, expecting my grandfather's scowl. The baker next to me saw me freeze and touched my arm. "Breathe," she whispered. "We all have tough days." She slid me a glass of water, and the simple act of kindness brought tears I could not hold back. It was around that time I first noticed Sebastian. He came into the bakery almost every morning ordering a coffee and a plain croissant. Always polite, always with a gentle smile. He was a bus driver, he said, on his way to the depot before the sun even rose. He carried himself like someone who'd seen hardship, but refused to be hardened by it. One rainy morning, the bus he drove ran late, and he ducked into the bakery soaked to the bone. I offered him a towel and a second croissant on the house. He laughed a warm, easy sound, and we talked. Not about me, not about my past, but about the weather, about how sourdough was making a comeback. He visited every day after that, eventually slipping into the seat across from me while I finished the morning shift. We spoke in small moments, sharing a laugh over a lopsided muffin, comparing favorite childhood candies, marveling at how East LA seemed to come alive at dawn. I was terrified of letting any man get too close. Instinct told me to run, but Sebastian treated me like a person, not a vessel or a mystery. He listened when I spoke about my love of drawing and the way I missed the quiet sunrise at home, even though home had never felt safe. After 3 months, he asked if I'd like to join him for a walk in the small park around the corner. My heart hammered, but I said yes. We strolled under jacaranda trees, purple blossoms drifting down like confetti. He told me about his dream of owning a little ranch on the city's outskirts, raising chickens, planting an avocado tree, or just having a place to call our own. When he asked me what I dreamed of, I paused so long I thought he might leave. Then I whispered, "Peace," and he nodded, as if that was the wisest thing anyone had ever said. It was Sebastian who reminded me that love could be gentle. He never rushed me into intimacy. Some nights he simply walked me home and stood at the gate until he was sure I was safe inside. Other times, he brought me a book on local birds, and we'd sit on my little balcony, just two people watching sparrows flit between power lines. He never asked about my scars. He just held my hand when my nightmares awakened me at 3 in the morning, fumbling for a sentence to remind me where I was, and that I was no longer a captive. Jeanette remained my guide, too. She came every couple of weeks to check on my healing. In Jeanette's kitchen, I brewed chamomile tea and chopped fresh mint from her garden. She introduced me to peer support at a local community centre, a small circle of women survivors who met once a week. The first meeting, I sat quietly while others spoke of their own cages, abusive partners, trafficking rings, cults of silence. When it was my turn, I folded my hands and said I baked today without crying. The group erupted into supportive applause. That was the first moment I realized I belonged somewhere, not because of my past, but because of my courage to show up. We shared affirmations. I am safe. I am worthy. I choose life. We taught each other grounding techniques. Pressing feet into the carpet, naming 5 things in the room. Reciting our full names and birth dates until our memories anchored in the present. We brought snacks each week, fruit salad, cupcakes, tamales, and sat around a battered table listening, really listening without judgment. It was there that I learned the difference between surviving and healing. Therapy also opened new doors. My psychologist, Dr. Vargas, adapted my treatment plan to blend talk therapy with art. She invited me to bring pencils and sketch pads to sessions. At first, I drew my old house, the one with peeling paint and a broken porch swing, eyes downcast in every window. Dr. Vargas gently encouraged me to add soft light around the edges to show the shape of a sunrise beyond the roof. I hesitated, then took up a violet pencil and shaded the sky. That single stroke felt like a promise. Over months of EMDR and CBT, I reclaimed my body, learning that touch could be healing, not just painful. Sebastian accompanied me to a few sessions, sitting quietly in the waiting room, leafing through magazines until I emerged, blinking into the lobby. He never pried, never rushed, just held out his hand, ready to catch any fragments of me that still trembled. With my heart growing more whole, I found the courage to save more money. Sebastian and I pooled our earnings, trusted and hopeful, and in 1984, we bought a small ranch in Riverside County. It wasn't much, just a modest house, a patch of land, a handful of fruit trees, and a few hens clucking in the yard. But it was ours, a place where no shadows from the past could follow us unless we invited them. On that ranch, I discovered new rhythms, dawn conversations with horses, the soft thump of eggs into baskets, the scent of lavender in our meadow. I planted a rosebush near the porch, brushing my fingers along its thorny stems, and marveling at how something so fragile could also be so strong. Each blossom felt like a victory, a testament to how far I had come. Along the way, I let myself dream again. I penned small poems about resilience. Rooted in darkness, I grew toward light. I painted canvases of sunrise fields. I hosted Saturday morning breakfasts for neighbors, sharing my bakery's cinnamon buns and my newly learned confidence. I volunteered at a nearby women's shelter, teaching baking classes and mentoring girls who reminded me of the frightened child I once was. Mistakes still happened. I had days when the nightmares surged, and I retreated to bed, refusing calls even from Sebastian. I had moments of isolation, convinced that no one could truly understand. But this time I reached out. I called Dr. Vargas, scheduled an extra therapy session, or texted a friend from the support group. I learned that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. When I stumbled, there was always a network ready to steady me: my husband's steadfast love, Jeanette's herbal remedies, the survivors' circle's fierce solidarity, the therapist's gentle guidance, the ranch's quiet promise of renewal. I wasn't alone. Never again. Standing now on our porch, watching the sun crest the horizon beyond the avocado tree, I feel the warmth on my face and know this is what freedom tastes like. Safety choice love. I built my life piece by piece, guided by small acts of courage and countless hands extended in support. In the next chapter, I will share how Sebastian and I faced the question of children, how we learned that motherhood can take many forms, how we opened our hearts to children in need, and how that chapter taught me that family is defined not by blood alone, but by the love we choose to give. When Sebastian and I learned that I could never carry another child, we sat long into the night on the porch swing, the hum of cicadas our only witness. I remember the moment he took my hand and said, "We have so much love to give. Let's find children who need us." Those simple words unlocked a new chapter for us, one in which motherhood would be an act of choice, compassion, and deliberate courage. We began the adoption process in early 1984, armed with nothing but hope and a battered savings book. The paperwork was daunting: home studies, background checks, interviews, and stacks of references. Every night we filled out forms by lamplight, Sebastian's steady voice reading each question aloud, while I wrote my answers in careful script. "Why do you want to adopt?" the social worker asked. I paused, thinking of those 10 babies I'd never held, the soft weight of each one that had slipped through my arms. because every child deserves a home where they are wanted. I wrote. It was the truth, distilled into a single sentence. Our first placement was Marina, a 4-year-old girl with haunted eyes and hands that twisted together when she was nervous. During our first visit, she sat on her cot in the shelter dormitory body, curled as if to make herself small. I knelt on the cold concrete floor and began to sing a lullaby I remembered from my own childhood. Her eyes flicked up at me, guarded but curious. By the third day, she let me braid her hair. By the fifth, she slipped her small hand into mine as we walked the shelter's garden path. When she finally whispered, "Mom," my heart expanded in a way I never thought possible. Marina taught us patience. She arrived with scars invisible to most, a fear of sudden movements, a startled response to loud noises, a constant vigilance that spoke of loss and rejection. We learned to move gently in our home, keep our voices calm, and establish routines that promised safety: breakfast at 8, school bus at 8:15, story time at 7. Each ritual was a brick in the foundation of trust we were building. I learned that love sometimes means waiting. Waiting for that first genuine smile, that first "I love you" spoken without prompting. When she finally said it, we celebrated with homemade cinnamon rolls and tears of joy. 2 years later, we met Carlos and Anna's siblings, aged 6 and 2, who had lost their parents in a car accident and bounced through foster homes. Carlos carried himself like a small man, burdened with adult worries. Anna hid under blankets and refused to speak. On the day we brought them home, I held Anna close while Sebastian gathered Carlos in a bear hug. We promised them a room painted sky blue with shelves for books and toys of their choosing. In the months that followed, we watched Carlos transform from a watchful guardian to a carefree boy who chased fireflies in the yard. Anna began to chatter in baby talk, then full sentences, finally laughing at our attempts to teach her how to ride a bike. Adopting wasn't a download of love, it was an investment. We attended parenting classes on attachment, read every child development book we could find, and enlisted the help of therapists to ease the siblings' trauma. We also learned to recognize the signs that needed our attention. Nightmares that left them drenched in sweat. Tantrums erupting without warning. Sudden withdrawals when they felt overwhelmed. When those moments came, we drew on the lessons from my own journey, offer a grounding exercise, a calm voice, a safe word that meant "I'm here," and nothing more. Wim, the baby we welcomed in 1990, arrived without the weight of past trauma, abandoned at a church door hours after birth. He gurgled and cooed and filled the spaces in our home with pure delight. Watching him grow alongside Marina, Carlos, and Anna brought a healing energy I hadn't known I needed. We planted a garden together, each child picking their favorite vegetable. We sketched pictures of our future ranch. We laughed until our sides ached. Wim's innocence reminded me that life can start fresh, that love can cascade forward across generations. Through adoption, I came to see motherhood not as a biological lottery, but as a choice, a commitment to nurture, to protect, to teach resilience. And so, as our family grew, Sebastian and I also committed ourselves to something larger, a promise to help other children at risk of exploitation or neglect. We volunteered at local shelters, teaching baking classes that doubled as safe spaces for teenagers in crisis. We distributed flyers with the National Human Trafficking Hotline number 1-8888-373-7888 and posters listing 5 common signs of trafficking. Sudden changes in behavior, unexplained injuries, lack of control over personal schedule, fearful or anxious demeanor, and inconsistent stories about home life. In our community meetings, we saw how easily a neighbor might dismiss a girl who never attended school regularly or a family who suddenly had more money than they could explain. That's none of our business, people would say. We challenged that complacency by telling our story how silence had cost me my adolescence, how anonymity had protected my grandfather's crimes. We urged them to trust their instincts. If you suspect something, ask questions. If you see a child who seems afraid of a parent or guardian, check in, offer a snack, a ride home, a listening ear. Take a photo of a license plate. Report it. You might save a life. We also learned the hard way about common mistakes. Well-meaning volunteers sometimes overwhelmed children with too many questions at once, re-traumatizing them instead of comforting them. Authorities occasionally dismissed reports as family drama rather than potential abuse. Neighbors sometimes took photos of victims instead of gathering actionable details, dates, times, descriptions of vehicles needed for investigations. We worked with organizations like Polaris Project to train local volunteers in trauma-informed response, how to approach a frightened teenager, how to ask, "Are you safe here? Would you like help?" and how to connect them with certified caseworkers. Through our advocacy, I have seen the quiet power of community vigilance. A library in our county partnered with law enforcement to display a safe haven poster in every restroom stall. A group of high school students ran an anti-trafficking campaign on social media, sharing the hotline number in their stories. When I speak at town halls, I remind people that exploitation often hides in plain sight. A teenager who never leaves home, a sudden car trip at night, a pattern of late fees and unexcused absences. The more we name these red flags, the harder it becomes for predators to operate under the cover of normalcy. My message to you, my dear friends across America, is this: look beyond appearances. A family that seems prosperous might be built on hidden suffering. A teenager who smiles at school might be screaming inside. And if you worry you're wrong, it's better to be wrong once than to let a child slip through your fingers. You are not meddling. You are protecting the most vulnerable among us. If you see a situation that feels off, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 1-888-373-7888, or text HELP to 2233733. You can remain anonymous. You can save a life without knowing you did. You can be the person who believes, who asks, who shows up. In my life's darkest chapters, I felt utterly alone. But today, I stand on a porch filled with children's laughter, a husband's steady hand, and friends who won't look away. I learned that justice isn't a lightning bolt. It's a steady gathering of small actions, a phone call, a shared poster, a whispered question in a hallway. Together we can change the world, one child at a time. So take heart. When you see suffering, let your heart ache, but then let your hands move. Offer your time, your voice, your compassion. Teach your neighbors the signs. Support local shelters and hotlines. Because every child deserves to grow up safe, loved, and free, and it's up to all of us to make that promise real. Until the next sunrise, let us be the light.